Let's go live to New York to our good friend Joe DioGuardi. We miss him. I was in Washington last week and then on to the Azalea Festival, so we weren't able to connect with Joe. And he's out there, and he's still laying tracks in the political driveway, trying to get folks to understand how important it is to change our form of accounting for our fiscal activities of our government. In a new article headed "Time to Pay on the Most Expensive Credit Card in the World," Joe DioGuardi says by now you probably filed your income tax for 2013 and made your final payment on the balance due. What you probably didn't realize is, however, it is you only paid the current balance. Joining us live from New York, Joe DioGuardi. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Curtis. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine.
Sorry. I sent you something that I thought I should put out now because I put it out with different numbers 20 years ago. I dusted it off. It was something that I created because I felt that people didn't really understand, balance sheets and profit and loss statements because most of them don't have direct investments in corporations like they had many, many years ago. They invest in mutual funds. So I said, but everybody's got a credit card, and everybody gets a credit card statement. So why don't I take the budget of the United States of America and start off with the debt we owe, in other words, what we haven't raised in taxes, in other words, the national debt, at the beginning of the year, and put it as your share. Now, since we have over 300 million people in America, I think it's about 310, I had to go back and see how many of those people last year filed income tax returns. It's 135 million. So I took that number to divide it into the debt, and I got per person numbers. But then what I did is I extended the analogy. I went for the current year. I said, well, look what the government spent, and I called those purchases for you during the year. This is what your representatives appropriated from our taxes for you, your share of the Department of Health and Human Services. That's by far the biggest one, Medicare and Medicaid, and then Social Security, Defense, Veterans. I went down in a descending order. And then I put, you did pay something, and here's your share of the income taxes you paid last year, Social Security taxes you paid, corporate taxes, and then Medicare taxes, and then we have miscellaneous excise taxes. We'll get back to that in a minute. And then the last category, as you have in any credit card statement, is what was your finance charge? Since you didn't pay off everything at the beginning of the year, you had interest to pay. And sure enough, that is the interest on the national debt, and I showed your share of that, coming up with a new balance and showing that we increased your share this year per taxpayer approximately $7,000 to $8,000.
And give them that number, Joe. Now understand, you're saying that this number of the balance due of the national debt is for those who actually file income taxes.
Yeah, well, I have to figure, if I'm going to say per taxpayer, I've got to say, who filed tax returns. So per taxpayer. But I could have said, since it's 136, and if you look at what are households today, it's about 2.5 to 3. It's about the same number. So if you take the 310 million people and you wanted to know how many families, households are there in America, the IRS does look at that. You're talking about 2.5 or below 3 per family. So it's about the same number, the amount of taxpayers and the amount of households. So you get kind of a correlation that, hey, you know what we're doing here? We're now saying that each taxpayer and probably each family has a remaining balance they haven't paid, and that's the national debt. Now, what I did, as you can see from my statement, is I didn't put the $17 trillion and divide it by the 135 million people. I actually created, looking at the statements that we put out September 30th, and I'm sure we've said this a number of times, we do put out annual statements, but they're not on what we call the liability basis of accounting, or what accountants called accrual basis. So I went to the footnotes. I went into the sustainability numbers that we now have below the balance sheet for the United States of America since 2009, when we changed it for the first time, and I reconstructed the real debt. And basically, that's about $72 trillion, because you have each tax, and I show each taxpayer's share on this statement. You have the $17 trillion in bonds, You have another $38 trillion in Medicare and Social Security. And an article I sent you months ago, I computed what the massive expansion of Medicaid would be over 75 years for the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. That's another $17 trillion. If you add those four numbers up, you have your $72 trillion. Divide that by 137 or 136 million people. Each taxpayer's or each family's share of the national debt at the beginning of the year, hold on to your seat, is $513,963. Over $500,000 per taxpayer, or if you want to say per family, and that went up to $520 with this statement that I put out by the end of the year.
Now let's if you listen to folks in the media, I'm talking about even those who are objective, they calculate things the way the government does. They've put out a number of like 53,000 per person who lives in America. Now that's everybody, and the way you've calculated, it's actually 520,975. Did I get that correct?
That's right. If you went on a per person basis, you would divide that number of 72 trillion by the 310 million people approximately that are in America today, and you would get a number that is still over $300,000 a person. So there is a big difference in looking at the national debt that they say is represented by Treasury bills of 17 trillion, and what I'm saying is the real national debt. As real accountants would tell you, you got to add in the unfunded, unrecorded liabilities for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And that brings it up to another number because at some point it's going to have to be paid unless we decide we're going to renege on those promises, and no one wants to even talk about that these days.
It's just, and I think the average, and maybe this may seem strange for you to make this comment, but I think the average income of Americans is about $46,000.
Right.
Now, can you imagine telling your banker you make $46,000 a year, but you've already racked up $520,000, $975,000 worth of just debt on your credit cards?
That's exactly right, and that's why I use the analogy of a congressman or congresswoman's voting card, which is the same size as a plastic credit card that you might have from MasterCharge or Visa or American Express. And it kind of hit me when I was in Congress in the late 80s that every time I put that card into the computer terminal at the end of a row of seats, I was pushing up the deficit, as we did even under Ronald Reagan for 1 year, $200 billion. But he was building up the military in order to bankrupt the Soviet Union. Much of the money we're spending today is on programs, benefits.
It's good to have him back, and I'm glad we were able to connect this week. We missed him last week. Joe DioGuardi, former congressman, CPA, and author of Unaccountable Congress.